So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gary Walton.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm really gratified that so many people took the time to come out. I guess you're interested in sin, huh? I guess I should say right off the bat that I am not a historian, okay? I am a writer. I like fiction. I like stories. And so my novel is really the confluence of two different mythological or myths that sort of converged into one thing. I was always fascinated by all the stories I heard about old Newport, and then I was also interested in all the stories that, because of, I guess, my age. I grew up with the Kennedy assassination, and so that was always in the back of my head, and one day I got an idea about putting the two together, and that's really where the novel came from. The front of the book is from the marquee of the old Glen Rendezvous Hotel, which was down on Monmouth Street. And originally, instead of my novel, it was the ink spots, because the ink spots were playing there when this picture was taken. So, I mean, Newport was really a happening place. So, I have a few of my other books back there, and maybe if I'm invited back, we can, maybe I can do a poetry reading. My latest book of poetry is Waiting for Insanity Clause. So you can see I have a bit of a sense of humor about my writing. And so, I mean, I take this stuff sort of seriously, but not too seriously. And I certainly don't take myself too seriously when it comes to all this stuff. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can go back and look at some of my books, and if you are of a mind, you're more than welcome to purchase one. So Newport, Kentucky. So this is from 1957 Esquire article about Newport, Kentucky, where it got its moniker, Sin City. Well, actually, he named it Sin Town, but later on in another article by Look magazine, I believe it was, they called it Sin City, and also there was a placard advertising the magazine at that time, and they called it Sin City. And the thing to remember about Newport is that before Vegas was Vegas, there was Newport, okay? And Newport really, its Sin City really goes back to the Civil War, because the General Hooker, who was a general who was in charge of the northern section of the Army, was based here in Cincinnati, and across the river, they had a camp where the men could sort of have fun, right? And Hooker used to allow wives to come into camp, and also what were called hooker girls, okay? And so these camp followers eventually just were called hookers, right? And so Newport was famous for all sorts of nefarious entertainment, let us say, okay? So this is, as I say, this is from Cross Section USA Sintown. So Newport is in Campbell County, and the whole area is generally referred to as Northern Kentucky. And Northern Kentucky serves as the playground not only for the bustling Cincinnati, with its more than 500,000 population, but for a vast area within a 100-mile radius. An estimated 1 million Americans come to Northern Kentucky with money in their pockets for gambling and or pretty girls. Now this is 1957, right? 1 million people come, tourists. Visitors spend an estimated 30 million a year in gambling and women. Payoffs in Northern Kentucky may function with little interruption are said to be $1 million annually. And that's probably an underestimate. So here's another article. This is a famous article from Esquire. This is the same thing, only this is from the magazine itself. And you could probably get this online. When I first started all this, since I'm a geezer, I started before there was an internet. And I used to find out this information, I had to go to libraries like this one, and I would look things up in the card catalog, right? Remember those? And then I would go to the stacks, remember those? and I was looking for pictures and things like that. And when many times I'd go and somebody had stolen the picture, which is a very Newport thing to do, I think. you know. So it didn't surprise me, I guess is what I'm saying. So here we have some more epigraphs. This is from Time magazine from 1961. There's rarely been any problem about betting a buck or buying a babe in Newport, Kentucky, a red brick town just a 9-minute, $1.35 cab ride across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. The town's traditions trace back to the female followers who camped around the U.S. Army barracks, which I just told you about. Since then, Newport has developed such a gaudy brand of gambling and prostitution that it stands today as one of the nation's most blatant sin centers. And if you go to Newport today, of course, it's squeaky clean. I mean, it's almost boring now, right? So all of this has sort of gone into the dark mists of mythology. Thoughtful Newport grocers used to keep stools handy so the local tots could climb up to play the slot machines. In fact, I'll tell you about slot machines here in a second. Cincinnati high school kids came roistering across the river to take advantage of the whorehouse specials, $1 for the prostitute and $1 for the madam. When one statistics-minded citizen clocked the trade at Newport's biggest brothel, he discovered that the 11 girls averaged a new customer every 7 minutes from noon Saturday to 6 a.m. the following Monday. Those are some busy girls. The town had its spattering of killings, but they were generally shrugged off as self-defense. One Easterner was shot in self-defense while sound asleep. In fact, I was just reading, I published an article about Old Newport in the Journal of Kentucky Studies, and I think I might have another copy back there, and you're welcome to peruse this one, by Richard Chalice, who was the youngest member of the Committee of 500, which I'll talk about, which was a reform committee. And he got his master's degree at Northern, and he wrote an oral history about Old Newport. And one of the facts that he dug up was that when it came to prostitution, you had one-way streets in Newport. And so Mama Street goes north, and so the daytime brothels were on Mama Street, and then York Street was south, and then when people came home, they could stop off on their way home on York Street. So it's very handy. They keep the customer in mind, right? So this is the Saturday Evening Post from 1960, and this is another big expose they did. Now, one of the few journalists that had the courage to write about Newport during its mobster days was Hank Mezack. He was a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal. The local papers were a lot more circumspect when it came to activities in Newport, mainly because it was dangerous to talk about it. The mob didn't like to be talked about, and so most of the local papers just didn't say anything. You know, just like everybody knew what was going on in town, but nobody said anything. And the thing you've got to keep in mind is that gambling, especially in the middle part of the 20th century, was the biggest industry in northern Kentucky. In Newport, sure, you had the trout dairy, right? And there were a couple of smaller businesses. And then in Southgate, you had the steel mill. But by and large, everybody was touched one way or another with the money from gambling and the other activities, right? So, I mean, it didn't mean that you were necessarily involved with the mob specifically, but you may have delivered meat or, you know, beverages or whatever. Many people were involved in the gambling. Some people were croupiers, some card dealers. You had hat check girls. You had cigarette girls in those days. And also think about after the war, or even before the war, where you had, you didn't have the kind of radio and everything we had now. People went out for dinner and they went to floor shows. And so people would go to these clubs in Newport for entertainment, and that didn't necessarily mean that you gambled, right? And this was true really up until, until the 70s, you know. But Hank Mezack, he published a lot of articles about Old Newport, and he was really a crusader, and he really opened it up. And his the first book I ever read about Old Newport was Syndicate Wife. It was from the wife of Trigger Mike Coppola, right? And it was from her point of view and what her life was like, being a mob wife, right? Razzle Dazzle, this is when I met Hank. He'd just come out with Razzle Dazzle, which was another book about the mob in northern Kentucky and specifically Newport. And it looks like we're old buddies there, but he was, I was just leaning over and he was nice enough to take a picture with me. And then he also has this big expose, and I've got a couple of his books in the back if you want to look at them, about mob and the mafia in the United States in general. So this was a placard from his, from the book signing of Razzle Dazzle. I'm going to talk about Screw Anders here in a minute. You can see him trying to punch out a local reporter. In Razzle Dazzle, he has this map, and it's a fascinating map because it has all of the different clubs in Newport, okay? So you see Columbia Street down at the bottom, and then York Street. When you came off the Central Bridge, it kind of went kind of askew over there, and then up. And he has all the clubs listed, and then he has a list of them. And I have, if you have this handout that I prepared, if not, you can share with each other. But I have a list of the clubs and their addresses on the back here. And well, anyway, I'm having trouble with the machine here. But the clubs in Newport, especially after World War II, were divided into basically two types. There were the carpet clubs, and these are more Vegas type clubs, the kind of that if you go out to Vegas today, you'll even see, right? And they called them carpet clubs because they had the thick carpets on the floor and all of that. And you could go and see a floor show. They had national acts that come through. I can remember back in the 70s, the Beverly Hills used to have the Rat Pack. Was there, it would come in, Phyllis Diller, you name it, these national acts would be there. And, but then you also had these other more neighborhood type clubs, and these are sometimes called bust out joints. And people tended to lose their money in the bust out joints, right? But I want to back up just a second, because even going back before Prohibition, the first slot machine, and Charlie, my brother-in-law, brought in an example, if you want to look at it when we end here, brought the first slot machine in after World War I. He had bought it in Chicago, and he just bought it on a fluke. He was from down in Kentucky, Clay County, and he brought it up to Newport, and he installed it in a bar, and before he knew it, people were just playing the heck out of it, right? He goes, well, this is a great idea, so he went up and bought a bunch more. And before long, there were slot machines all over Newport. And back in the day, everybody had slot machines, right? The drugstore, the barber, everybody, right? You'd walk into the barber and, the chairs would be in the front, and then there'd be some curtains, and then right behind the curtains you'd have maybe 2 or 3 slot machines, right? Now, if the grand jury was in session, because all this is illegal, they had these velvet coverlets that they used to slip over the slot machines, right? Surprise, they don't exist anymore, right? Nobody sees them anymore because they got a velvet coverlet on it. And then when the grand jury was out of session, they just take them off and go back to business as usual. But they had Chuck-a-Luck, they had little cards where you could punch out the cards and see if you won. Back rooms had, low stakes and high stakes poker games. In fact, when the gambling museum was open and Larry was taking tours, we went on a tour of the gambling museum was in the original bar there was that this Frontier Bar? Well, and he also had chalk marks of where the bodies of people who were shot over disagreements were on the floor. But if you went downstairs, they had oak paneling all the way down the steps, and you go down to this room downstairs, and that's where they had the poker game, right? And then they had they had a place for the phones because everybody was betting, doing off-track betting and that sort of thing. And then they had a window that if you wanted to go into the back room, sort of like a doctor's office, right? But if you were a special person, they'd give you the okay, and you could go into the back room. And then they had steps going up the back way to the rooms over top, and of course, that's where some of the girls plied their trades. And so you could, sit out a hand or two, go upstairs, spend a little time, come back down, and finish your game. See, Newport. Now, of course, because of the Volstead Act and Prohibition, alcohol sales became illegal. Well, of course, that didn't stop people in Newport. And of course, Kentucky, we had a reputation for illegal moonshine anyway, right? And so, there really wasn't any cessation in being able to get illegal alcohol. Even during Prohibition, the Wiedemann Brewery, which was one of the big employers in Newport, made over 1 million gallons of alcohol a year, even during Prohibition. Now, this fellow here, George Remus, he was a guy who was born in Germany, and he came to the United States, and he was raised in Chicago, and his father was a pharmacist, okay? So he grew up in the pharmacist trade. Well, he studied at night and got his law degree. So he was both a pharmacist and he was a lawyer, okay? And during Prohibition, he knew that if you were a pharmacist, you could legally sell alcohol for medicinal and industrial uses, but you had to have one of these certificates, okay? Well, those are easy enough to forge, and so he had plenty of certificates. And he looked at a map to see where all the alcohol had been made in the United States, and he realized that Cincinnati, within 200 to 300 miles of Cincinnati, 80% of all the alcohol in the United States was distilled, okay? In fact, in Cincinnati, at one time, Cincinnati itself had over 300 breweries. And of course, now with all the microbreweries, we're getting back up there again, right? But so he moves to Cincinnati, and he sets up shop here, and he becomes what some people call the king of the bootleggers, okay? He starts paying off everybody because it's illegal, okay? And he starts buying alcohol from wherever he can get it. He buys the Fleischmann's distillery in downtown Cincinnati, but he also makes deals with all kinds of distilleries, to do it sort of under the table all over the area, okay? But he also starts buying moonshine that they run up from southern Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. Did you know that stock car racing came from running illegal booze, right? Because they needed hot cars to outrun the feds. And it's the truth. In fact, I was just watching Jay Leno's auto show, and they had one of the old rum runner cars on display. And sometimes, they would just put the jugs in the trunk, but sometimes they actually had tanks on them. But anyway, they would come up to Newport, they would unload, sometimes they would load them on train cars, and Remus would send all kinds of booze up to Al Capone in Chicago, okay? He became fabulously wealthy. This is his house, a picture of his house in Price Hill. And this is, he married a local girl by the name of Imogene. She was the daughter of a lawyer that he had used in business. And so anyway, he throws lavish parties, and she loved jazz, This was the age of the flappers. This was the jazz age, right? And they threw parties, and everybody who was anybody came to these parties, right? He had artwork from all over the world. He had one of the first heated pools in the area, okay? He had pianos, grand pianos all over the place. He would give gold watches to the women or he'd give cars to the women as party favors, before Oprah, right? And he'd give men gold watches, right? And so, we're talking about governors, we're talking about senators, all kinds of people. And of course, he's paying off so many of them, right? And they're on best of terms. And this goes along fine, except that he forgot to pay off the feds. So he paid off the local people, but he forgot to pay off the feds. And so eventually they bust one of his operations, right? And he gets convicted and has to go away for 5 years, all right? So in the meantime, he made a bit of a mistake. He put all of his money into his wife's name, okay? While he's gone, she starts dating the Fed who busted him. So she starts dating him, and when George gets out of prison, she divorces him, okay? Well, one day, George Remus is driving in his car over in Eden Park, and he sees her car. And one story I had, it was actually his old limousine, and she and her daughter was in the back. Well, he steps on the gas, forces the car over to the curb. He hops out of the car, runs to the back, opens up the back door, grabs his wife, throws her out of the car, and shoots her in the head. Okay? So then he gets back in his car, and he drives down to the local police station and turns himself in. Well, this starts one of the greatest murder trials in the 20th century history. Okay? And if you can see here on the handout I gave you, trial of the century. The prosecutor was Charlie Taft, the president's son. Yeah, and since Remus was a lawyer, he defended himself, right? And so he uses as his defense the first time that the insanity defense was ever used, right? And so like I say, it's a trial that goes on and on and on and on and on. It's on all the papers, and everybody's, it would be on one of the tabloids today, right? And the jury comes back and they acquit him, right? He isn't quite totally acquitted because he says he was insane, so he has to spend some time in a mental institution. So he spends, a couple of months in a mental institution, and when they let him out, he's free as a bird. But, of course, all his money is gone. His reputation is shot. And it really took a toll on him. He eventually just moves into an apartment in Covington, and he just start the rest of his life as a quiet man. Now, what makes him so fascinating, his character shows up in several movies and books. In fact, there's 2 new books coming out about George Remus, or just came out in August, about both his biography and also the murder case. If you're interested in the murder case, though, I have the Holden's book, and I think I've got it listed here for you. Yeah, The Jazzbird by Craig Holden. It's a fascinating book that he writes it as a fiction, but it's all based on fact, and it's really a fascinating read, and it's really worth your time if you're interested in that sort of thing. The other thing I was going to mention, and I haven't been able to verify this, but I've heard it in several places that F. Scott Fitzgerald used Remus as the model for The Great Gatsby, because the character is very much the same, and he was widely known in the 20s all over the country. He's probably the 3rd or 4th biggest gangster in the country at that time. There's his grave there in Falmouth. I haven't made my pilgrimage down there yet, but if you go down that way, you might be able to look him up. He'd probably appreciate a visit. So Wiedemann Brewery had its problems during that period too, because it was an open secret that they were creating illegal alcohol. And so they were in and out of court. This is from 1927. If you go, unfortunately, if you go to Newport today, where Wiedemann Brewery has been all torn down. It's all gone. It's a shame because it was a foundation of the city for so many years. So many people worked there. I know a lot of my relatives worked there. Some of them anyway. And you can, I think the mansion, the Wiedemann Mansion, is still there up over from 10th Street, And they used to have tours. I don't know if they still have tours there or not. Well, okay, so Remus goes to prison. He had, he had about a dozen associates that he needed during his operation. And one of them was this fellow by the name of Peter Schmidt, okay? Well, when Remus goes into prison, Schmidt comes to Newport and decides that he wants to try his hand at being the boss. And he builds the original Glen Rendezvous Hotel on Monmouth Street, but he also buys a roadhouse called the Canetunk Castle, okay, in Southgate, okay? And he remodels it, and when he reopens it, he calls it the Beverly Hills. So this is an early version of the Beverly Hills. They were constantly revamping it. Of course, it burned down a couple of times too. That didn't hurt. But you can see the porte cochere there in the front, and this became one of the premier carpet clubs in the area. And this is the club where, as I say, even up through the 60s and early 70s, really, they had national acts come in, about once a year, Dean Martin would play. Frank Sinatra, right? The thing to remember too is that in Newport proper, in the Glen Rendezvous and some of the other clubs, you had a lot of national acts play here even in the 40s, 30s and 40s, Duke Ellington played here, for example, So I mean, it was an important entertainment stop. So this was the original entrance in Southgate to the Beverly Hills, and you would go through this and you'd go up to the top of the hill, right? Did anybody here go to Beverly Hills when it was? You have good memories of the place?
Oh yeah.
Did you gamble?
John Davidson.
Would you admit it? Well, you didn't have to, right? I mean, you just go there. You could go to a show. You could, people had their proms there. They had the wedding receptions. It was just a nice venue, right? And they did a pretty good job of keeping all the other stuff away if you weren't interested in it. So this was a photograph, an advertisement for Beverly Hills. Look how swanky it is. It makes you want to go there, doesn't it? I wouldn't mind going in there and having dinner, having a drink. See the mink stole she's wearing? So you dress up to go there. You wouldn't go there in jeans and flip-flops. This is the bar entrance. I mean, this is gorgeous, isn't it? You getting thirsty? Yeah, so it's a nice place, a swanky place, all right? So this is what the interior looked like. And you can see the big dance. You got the stage there. And it was a supper club, so you went there to eat, and usually they had a big dance floor, so you could dance. And so this is just one of the bars they had in there. And these are some postcards, that advertise the place. It must be a fancy place if they're going to advertise the ladies' lounge, But you could have your wedding there, other private parties. Now, the Beverly Hills wasn't the only game in town. In Kenton County, you had the Lookout House, okay? And the Lookout House, it was run by another one of George Remus's lieutenants who went out on his own. And it was on Dixie Highway. And it was there, I think it burned down too in the early 70s. I think that's when it burned. But see, in Newport, that's the way. Every time they wanted to remodel or every time they changed locations, wait, there's a fire. Well, goodness. So here's the exterior of the Lookout House. But it too was one of the big carpet clubs, right? This is the Glen Rendezvous, and this is a famous place for a couple of reasons. This is one of the first places that I said that Pete Schmidt, he made it into a happening club. He named it the Glen Rendezvous after his son. The Tropicana Club was on the first floor, and you could gamble in there if you wanted to. But this is also the site of the George Rademan scandal, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But and it burned down in the late 50s, unfortunately. But in my novel, a couple of the scenes are in this club, as well as inside the Beverly Hills, as well as in Sleep Out Louie's place on York Street. Unfortunately, I don't even know if that building is there anymore. So here's the original picture of the cover of my book. See the ink spots? So I mean, it was a swanky place, right? So this is here's a picture. There's the Tropicana there on the left. So if you go to down to 4th Street, you know where the Peace Bell is? If you look north, all right, I think there's a Goodyear there now, but this is where the Merchants Club was, okay? And so if you were to walk outside the Merchants Club, you would see the Peace Bell, and across would be across the parking lot there would be the Syndicate restaurant. Well, this is where Red Masterson ran this place. That's Red right there. Now, Red was an enforcer for the mob. Now, he's a fascinating character in and of himself. He lived in Fort Thomas. If you know anything about Fort Thomas, where the Fort Thomas Library is, the Campbell County Library in Fort Thomas, almost right across the street is a house sort of a Mediterranean-style house. Well, that's where he used to live. And in fact, I was talking to I was giving one of these presentations several years ago, and a young man came up to me and said that he had grown up right around the corner, and he said they loved Red because on Halloween he'd give out silver dollars, you know. So, you can't hate a guy like that, right? But he was an enforcer, and so he is credited with certain, let us say, murders. Okay. He himself was the victim of an assassination attempt at one point also. One of the stories about him that I find funny is that when Pete Schmidt finally got the Beverly Hills going, and it was really going well, one of the big mob organizations, the Cleveland Four, who basically ended up running most of Newport, they decided they wanted a piece of the action. Well, they didn't want a piece of the action, they wanted the whole thing, and he didn't want to sell. So, they wanted to convince him. So what they did is they got Red to go up. This is a carpet club, a real swanky place, right? And he and some of his buddies would come in and do what they called ding-donging. Any guess what that might be? Well, here they have this real fancy place, with the chandeliers and all the nice curtains and stuff. And they would start urinating all over everything. And they called that ding-donging. And they kept it up and kept it up and kept it up. And among other harassments, eventually Pete decided, well, okay, I give up, I'll sell out. But if anybody take the gangster tour? Did they talk about Red down there? Yeah, so they'll show you where Red shot some people. And
I used to have a shotgun. He had a double-barrel shotgun that he'd sawed off, turned into almost a pistol. I donated to Eastern Kentucky University Law.
Is that right?
That's right.
I'd like to have that my own self.
I was a detective there with Frank Benton.
Is that right? You were?
Yeah, I can tell you some stories.
Okay, all right. In fact, I just had dinner with his son, Billy, the other day. Yeah, Frank. So other carpet clubs in Newport proper, this was the 633 Club or the Flamingo Club, and this is Sleep Out Louie's place, okay? Now, Sleep Out, some people call him part of the Jewish mafia, some people just say he was part of the New York mob. There was a sort of an uneasy balance between the Cleveland folks and the New York mob. Most of the Cleveland mob, though, the people who were in Newport came out of Steubenville, Ohio. Oh, by the way, going back to the Merchants Club, I meant to tell you that it was an Italian restaurant. Hey, there's a surprise. And they had singing waiters. And they had this kid from Steubenville, Ohio, and it was Dean Martin, right? And so he got his start here in Newport, Kentucky. It's one of the reasons he would come back. One of the other carpet clubs in its day was what was called the Primrose Club. Brady was another one of those lieutenants of George Remus's. Later on, it was sold into different hands, and it became the Latin Quarter. Some of you remember the Latin Quarter? Well, of course, today it's Bobby Mackey's, right? It's haunted, you know. There's probably good reasons for that, too. So there's some of the dancers at the Latin Quarter, and there you have a season's greeting advertisement for the Latin Quarter. So there's the interior for the Primrose when it was the Primrose, and then they made it into much more of a fancy club later, and that's that's the Latin Quarter. And you can see the bandstand and usually the dance floor was in front of it. And again, people would come there to eat and see a show. And you could gamble if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. And so this is Bobby Mackey's, but it's the same location. And if you watch those ghosty hunt shows, it's been on several times. Now originally I think the building, it probably was a tannery or something like that, because there was a pit in the basement. And nobody knows exactly what it was used for, but it was probably used in those early days for tanning purposes. Although, you know, if you wanted to get rid of somebody, you know. And also the Licking River's right there, so if you want to throw them in the Licking, you can too. So, tell you a quick story about that. One of the rumors, you know how the levee is built down there. When you go into the garage underneath the bridge, they've got all of that stonework. Well, that was a favorite place to go down and, you know, make people see your point of view, you know. And sometimes they'd find people just hanging there, you know, where they couldn't be convinced, apparently. Now, the Yorkshire was another one of those carpet clubs. That building is still there. Last I heard, it was a bakery. It's, what is that? Is that 5th and York? 5th and York? It's a sort of an Art Deco outside. And so that part is still there. Now, when I came back to this area, or I guess I was a road musician in those days, in the 70s they were using it for show bands. And you could go in, and when you walked in the front door, you would go down this long, well, it's an incline, you go down, and downstairs, that's where they used to have all the crap tables and all that, right? Well, I was down there one night, and I was listening to the show band, and I looked up, and the ceiling was like twice as high as this, so basically 2 stories of an extended ceiling, and about 3/4 of the way up, you'd see these rectangular holes in the wall. Well, that's where the guys sat with the shotguns, in case there was trouble. Yeah. So this is what it looked like probably, what would you say that is? That's probably mid-60s, early 60s. Looks like an old Pontiac or something there. But that would have been the entrance. And there's all kinds of bust-out joints in Newport. And these are places that were usually run by locals who paid a certain amount of their money back to the mob. And you had the Highlight Club, and I think that was on York Street. And then, not exactly, well, the Alexandria Club was 2124 Alexandria. So. One of the most infamous places was a Heidi Ho Club in Wilder, because it was both a brothel as well as a gambling joint. And the state police raided one time, and they found a lot of the prostitutes hiding up in the ceiling. But the owner, well, the politics of it gets kind of complicated, but since it was outside of Newport proper, the state police could raid it because the state police couldn't go into municipalities without being invited. And so they just surprised them one night, and I think it was owned by the sheriff in those days. So here's that placard I was telling you about, Newport, Kentucky, Sin City of the South, the Saturday Evening Post from 1960. So, Frank Screw Andrews. Andrews originally, I understand, was a moonshiner, but he owned a lot of these clubs on the west side of Newport. He owned the Sportsman Club. Were you around for the Sportsman Club? Do you remember?
I don't remember the name.
Do you remember? Well, originally it was on the west side, and I think they moved it down underneath the bridge, the central bridge.
314 Central.
314? You know that too well, I think. We should.
Kit used to come there. Duke Ellington used to come there.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's when everything was segregated, and so a lot of the clubs on the west side were black clubs. That's right.
Black Club.
Yeah, yeah. And here he is beating up a photographer who was trying to take a picture of him during one of his indictments. There on, I guess that looks like the Flamingo Club because you can see the church in the background. And this is just some of the kind of paraphernalia the police put on display. Look at all those slot machines, right? There's the roulette wheel, right? By the way, speaking of the Yorkshire Club, which was on Monmouth Street, right across the street was auto printing. And my understanding was there was a tunnel underneath the street. And so whenever a raid was coming, the mob would take all this kind of paraphernalia and take it down into the tunnel so that when the police showed up, we don't have anything like that, you know? Or they'd take it over into the printing office. So Screw met a sort of a mysterious death. He was in the hospital, and they say that he committed suicide, but one report there was a couple of gentlemen with Homburgs on who came to visit him right before he decided to try to fly. So whether it was a suicide or a murder, you know, it's Newport. You make your own decision. And these are just some dice from the 633 Club. There's a stir from, I think, the Glen Rendezvous. And we've got some dice back there. Are the dice for sale? So if you want some Newport dice, and you can put in your own load, right? Some of them are pre-drilled, so all you have to do is load them up yourself. And this is an ad for the Glen Rendezvous. Happening place, right? And these are just some other odds and ends. These are some paraphernalia from the Beverly Hills. When we think of Newport, you know, I was talking about shows, but they also had burlesque shows. Back in the 40s and 50s, burlesque was a little more genteel than we think of strip bars today. Newport became famous in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, for all nude dancing. You know, you had the Triple X Theater and all of that down there, and it became kind of a blight, and I think people really objected to that. But the burlesque shows had, you know, comedians as well as exotic dancers, you know, and they had all kinds. It was more like vaudeville, you know. And so you could see this kind of stuff too. Here's Ted Lewis. Ted apparently played Cincinnati a lot because he was a terrible gambler, and he would every week he'd gamble away his salary, so he had to work the next week for free, and so he ended up staying here. Here's another ad for Beverly Hills, and well, by the time we get to the late 50s and early 60s, see, Newport. The populace of Newport tolerated all of this because they didn't see it. Much of this stuff happened at night. When if you're a working person, you go to bed. You got to get up. You got to go to work. You never saw any of this stuff. Besides that, the mob did not tolerate any kind of petty theft, muggings, anything like that. My father grew up in Newport. He said that when he was a young guy that nobody locked their doors. You didn't have to. You know, if somebody was stupid enough to start mugging somebody, they just find them floating down the river. You know, because the mob wouldn't tolerate that. They had, you know, bigger fish to fry. But by the time you get to the late 50s and certainly by the early 60s, because of the Kefauver Commission in the 50s, then you had the organized crime investigations in the mid to late 50s. There was just too much heat on Newport. And besides that, by this time, Bugsy Siegel had gone to Vegas, this little desert town, and he'd built a hotel called the Desert Inn, and it was going gangbusters, and the big difference was, in Las Vegas, gambling was legal. So you didn't have to pay all these people off, you didn't have to worry, you didn't have all those headaches. And so by the early 60s, a lot of the heavy hitters had left Newport and gone to Vegas. And so you had a lot of the lower echelon guys running things, and they just weren't as, how do I want to put this? They didn't have the style that the other guys had, you know, so there was more violence and there was more trouble, and, you know, they would get caught doing things they shouldn't be doing, stupid stuff, you know, and it just brought more and more heat, and then the community started getting tired of it. And so you had people who wanted to reform, and of course you had this reform group probably going on for about 20 years. But there was a lot of inertia, you know. I mean, the churches didn't want a lot of laws that said they couldn't gamble, they couldn't have their church fairs and things like that. And most of the clergy just felt, well, what's the harm if people want to go in bed a little bit? What do we care? But things were starting to get out of hand, and so a committee of 500 was formed, of 500 people who wanted to reform Newport and get rid of these guys, right? And so they started looking around to see if they could find a candidate who would be a good challenger to one of the ones backed up by the mob, and they found George Ratterman. And Ratterman was rather famous in the area. He had played for some local teams. He'd gone to Xavier. He'd gone to Notre Dame, and he was a football star at Notre Dame. And I think he'd even played for some pro ball, a little bit of pro ball, with Browns, yeah. And so he was pretty well known, a smart guy, right? He was a lawyer, he was a smart guy. And so they asked him if he would run, and he said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. Okay, I mean, but the mob doing the things the way they do things. Now there's different versions of this story, and the common version is that he was friends with Tito Carinci, who was the manager of the Tropicana Club there on Mama Street. And the story is that Tito called him up and said, look, you know, he wanted some help to get out of the mob. You know, he wanted to see if George would help him out. So George agreed to meet him at a bar or a club over in Cincinnati. And so they're having a couple of drinks and talking things over, and that Tito or somebody had slipped George a Mickey Finn, right? Some chloral hydrate. Well, the next thing he knows, he's waking up in one of the upstairs bedrooms above the Tropicana Club in the Glen Rendezvous building, and his trousers are off or down around his knees, and he's in bed with one of the local strippers. Okay. Now there was supposed to be a photographer who was supposed to come in and take his picture, but the photographer chickened out. So they called the police, and police detective Seferdini shows up and arrests him, okay, and takes him down to jail. So the whole time, though, George claims that he was drugged and framed, all right? And so a trial ensues in police court, and it becomes a kind of a circus. And I'm going to hold off saying too much more about this because I have a bit of a documentary that WKET made, and I think you'd get a kick out of it. Yep, yeah.
I used to work with the patrolman. They first dispatched the patrol.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And the patrolman was Joe Twitter. He was in Campbell County. He was honest. Believe it or not.
Oh, yeah, I believe it. Sure.
Yeah. And anyway, they sent the patrol car there first, and then they called the detectives showed up anyway.
I see.
And prearranged apparently, but to make it look legitimate, there was a call in to the police department that there was some kind of commotion at the club. they send the patrol car, uniformed officers, and then the detective shows up later this happened to be in the neighborhood.
Yeah, just happened to be downstairs. Yeah, okay. You were talking about Frank Benton. He was the attorney for the committee, right, of 500.
Prosecuting attorney, he was elected after
Yeah.
Ratterman didn't get, he was as a Commonwealth attorney.
Right. I was just reading this the other day. They offered him, I think it was $10,000 a week if he would just go away.
I don't doubt it, but he was honest.
He was on. No, he didn't. But I mean, he was offered the money. Yeah.
Yeah, I worked in his office, so I knew what
I'm sure. Yeah.
more or less.
Here's some surviving members of the Committee of 500 with Hank Mezack. Now, this is probably 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Unfortunately, Hank has passed. I wanted to say this quickly about, I need to say it very quickly because I want to show this film. The connection between the Kennedys and Newport is an interesting story. You wouldn't think that, these people from Hyannisport would even know anything about northern Kentucky. But you have to remember one thing, that the Kennedy's father was an old rum runner himself. I mean, during Prohibition, he used to run Scotch whiskey into Canada and then bring it down by truck into the United States. And it's also one of the parts of the fuzzy history, or if you want to think of it as a conspiracy theory, that Jack won the election of 1960 just barely, right? And it is said in part because of the help of Sam Giancana in Chicago, who helped to secure not only Chicago votes but also West Virginia votes, which they needed to push them over the top. But Bobby also went to school with some local people, okay? So they knew each other. And one of the interesting things about it is, well, there's two interesting things about it. There's a news clip where Bobby is talking right before the election, talking to Al Fogarty, or one of the local reporters, saying that if his brother wins the election, that he's going to get rid of this stuff that's going on here in Newport, right? The other thing is that during the election, on election day, they kept close tabs on the vote counts in Campbell County, because Campbell County always went Republican. And if they couldn't win Campbell County, they didn't think they were going to win. And so and before the election, John came and visited some people here in Newport. So there was a lot of interest. There's another picture of him. Well, you can see here from Hank Mezack's book what I was just saying about Robert Kennedy and Cincinnati and the election. The first hard election news came in at 6:25. It came from Campbell County, Kentucky, whose county seat was Newport and whose principal industry was illegal gambling. A few months earlier, a weary Robert Kennedy had stood in a Cincinnati hotel room and, looking out the window and viewing Newport, promised a war on crime if his brother was elected. So this is, now, in terms of my novel, this is really, I had heard a story about Bobby Kennedy in Newport at the Beverly Hills, and I'd heard different versions of it, but it really intrigued me, and so I wrote a short story that was eventually published in Happy Magazine in New York. And it became the core of what became my novel, all right? And I don't know if we're going to have time, but if we do, I'll read some of that chapter for you. But if you know anything about the Kennedy assassination and all the rumors about the mob hating the Kennedys, a lot of it could very well be because of the relationship with the mob, and especially at this flashpoint here in Newport. Yeah, go ahead.
Follow up on Kennedy or whatever, he set up
Right.
That cracked down on the mob nationwide.
Absolutely, yeah. And he really had an animus about, especially about Newport. I mean, it's strange, you know. Did you? Oh, okay.
And then Nixon was using that ordinance
Yeah.
to get to his enemies.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Some things never change, right? Yeah.
We should not forget George Google and Johnny TV Peluso and all of this.
Where's Google? Well, you know, the original George Google testified before the Kefauver Commission. And in a famous answer he gave, they asked him, they said, we've heard all about all this gambling and everything that's going on in Newport, and we want to know, you know, you're the police chief, what do you have to say about it? He goes, I don't know anything about any gambling. And they said, well, the cab drivers will take people right to these places. And he says, I don't ride in cabs. And then he says, well, they said, we know the names of all these different clubs. He says, I don't go in those places. And so they said, well, listen, if you had to arrest somebody, how would you arrest them if you don't go in? He said, I just go to the door and tell them who I wanted, and they bring them out. Of course, the place just burst in laughter because it's so absurd, you know. Okay, so comments. Yeah.
When JFK visited that lady's house in Newport, I forget her name already, what was her claim to fame, or who was she?
You know, I'm not exactly sure. In fact, we could probably find out in one of those books. I know I've read it, I just can't remember. I know that Bobby had gone to school with one of the local lawyers at Harvard, but I don't know what her connection was. She may have been head of the Democratic Party, or, you know, in the area.
Glenn Schmidt, he wasn't really part of the mafia, he didn't probably have any part.
Well, Pete had named you know where the Syndicate is now? You've been to the Syndicate restaurant? Well, that was the old Platorium. And Pete had, after he sold off the Beverly Hills, went and built that place. It was a bowling alley, and it had meeting rooms and stuff. But you could also gamble there too. And next door was the snacks bar, and they had more off-track betting going through that particular place than any other place in the country. In fact, one of the reasons Newport made so much money, it really wasn't for the mob, it wasn't from gambling, it was from off-track betting. They were the mob bank, and so bookies all over the world, if they wanted to lay off some bets, they laid off the bets through Newport. And in fact, that building that's right across the street from the Peace Bell, if you're looking west, I guess, yeah, that would be west. That building, it's a lawyer's building now. Well, that's where there was a bank there, and that's where supposedly the mob bank was, in that building. Yeah.
Feds cut the phone line that ran from Newport to Cincinnati.
Is that right?
And when they cut the phone line, that ended the bookmaking in Newport. I have a friend who...
Well, in those days too, you have to remember that every phone had to have its own line. And so there were different offices in town where there were so many phone lines going in, you couldn't see the sky. Yeah, in fact, the story about old Newport back in the day too, during Prohibition, there were so many illegal stills, and you know, they had them people had them on their roofs, that there was so much smoke. They said they would take feed up, you know, to make for the stills, but they said they were up there feeding their chickens. But there was so much smoke coming from the stills that, again, it blotted out the sun. That's the story. That's the myth, anyway. That's the story. One of the last big killings in Newport was of Sammy Eisner. I don't know if you remember him. But there's still a big mystery about who killed Sammy Eisner. And I was doing a book signing over at the Duke Energy Center. They have a big thing there for new books. And a former state policeman came up and he said they had evidence of who did it, you know. So, but probably not enough, I guess, to go and get them, but present it, you know. Yes, ma'am. Johnny TV Peluso. Well, he was, he ran for sheriff against Ratterman and lost. But his family, have been a big part of Newport forever. I mean, and he had the family had a grocery store down there in Newport, and he had a TV repair shop. And that's why they call him, TV Peluso. Really a character. There for a while he ran the Grandview Gardens, which was up what they called Spaghetti Knob up 19th Street at the top up there. Tell you a couple quick stories about Johnny. When I was a musician for years before I became an academic, and we went up there one time. I had a show band, and we went up there to take some pictures because we wanted Cincinnati in the background. And it was in the morning, and we were out there, we were all dressed up and stuff, and we're taking our pictures. And all of a sudden, we hear this guy screaming, running across the lawn in his night clothes, and it was Johnny Peluso. And he goes, "What are you doing up here?" Well, I think it was one of those times he was under indictment. I guess he was afraid we were, taking pictures of him or something. And when we explained what we were doing, he was so thrilled that we thought of using his place that he said, "Well, here, I'll take your pictures." And so he got behind the camera and he started taking the pictures. Another quick story about Johnny. He was a known character. He was kind of a bad boy sometimes. He did do, I think it was 3 years or 5 years for tax evasion or fraud or something. But I came back to this area and I was down on Newport, and there used to be a garage called Neltner's there on Mama Street, or you know where I'm talking about? And I was coming out of the shopping center there, and I couldn't get out because there was a pink Cadillac convertible sitting right in the middle of the street with its engine running, and the door was open, And I thought to myself, there's only one person that would have the gall to do that and drive a pink Cadillac and leave it idling right in the middle of the street. It was Johnny Peluso, and just at that moment, he comes out of Neltner's hitting a pack of cigarettes. He needed a smoke, and so he just ran in and got a smoke and left his car running. He hopped in it, put it in gear, and took off.
He was on the city commission.
Yeah, oh yeah. He was around for. What's that? Yeah, the Pelusos are. Well, there you go. See, it's a family business. Yeah, so. Yeah.
But one thing you know about Johnny is on Thanksgiving Day, he had probably 500 or 600 turkeys, and he would take them to families who were in need.
And that's old school.
And he never paid for them.
He never paid for them. Yeah. But see, that's old school politics. Yeah, absolutely, sure. And people remember that. Absolutely. Come election day, you bet. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming. I sure do appreciate it.